Welcome to the Serious Leisure Podcast. My name is Petya Petrova. I'm the host of this podcast. You are listening to part 2 of 3 episodes we recorded with Professor Robert Stebbins. I'm, of course, joined by Sam Elkington and Kat Branch, and we talked to Bob about the importance of persevering with leisure and why serious leisure is not always easy or even not always enjoyable, but why it is that we stick with it. Enjoy! For those of you who have listened to us before, you will have an idea that Sam, Kat, and I are just competing as to who is going to ask the next question, because there was so much that Bob talked about. He talked about a little bit about research methodology and the qualitative-quantitative coexistence, or maybe debate. He also gave insights to those of you who are listening who are not from academia about how seriously we take researching our lives, and in this case, leisure, and what's involved in that, and kind of the depths and consideration around that. And just for context about what's happening next in our discussion, I come to this as a lay person in relation to the serious leisure perspective. This is not a field of research of my own, but I come from a perspective that academic literature often gives us a toolkit through which we can reflect on our experiences. And this is, in effect, what we have been doing with this podcast, talking about individuals' experiences and trying to have a conversation and a reflection of what that means to us through the lens of the serious leisure perspective and the concepts and ideas situated within that. Kat comes to this conversation as a person who has used the serious leisure perspective and the literature and evidence-based to talk about why this is valuable, and to continue to look for support for the Center for Music. And she'll tell us a little bit more about that, I have no doubt, later on. Sam came to this as a researcher in this field, but also as through the perspective of all of us three collectively about the value and importance of leisure in our lives, and trying to rethink and rebalance how we currently structure our lives and how society works for our conversation. So I'm just giving this summary about where we are all going to come in with our questions, that the three of us have a different take on this discussion. I'm going to pass on to Sam to tell us where are we heading next and which bit of what Bob just talked about, the five decades of serious leisure, we're going to unpack next.
Thanks, Petya. Yeah, where to begin, I think, is the question. We haven't got much to cover, have we? No, I mean, I've been very privileged to have known Bob for so long, and just for transparency, I guess, Bob was very kind to accept my invitation to be my external supervisor for my own PhD back in 2005. Still remember the conversation now. And it's safe to say that that decision and what followed has very much shaped my own career and my own kind of perspective, I guess, on how I approach not just the academic side of life, but also the broader side of life. And there's a bit of a joke in leisure studies, i.e., it's those folks studying leisure are so busy studying leisure they have no leisure of their own, which we hear the world over at conferences and all sorts. But the one thing I think about the serious leisure perspective that I want to highlight and then explore perhaps in a little bit more detail is the fact that it is grounded in the experiences of people. And I think that the testament to that, or the proof in the pudding, so to speak, is it is one of the few theoretic frameworks still around from 30, 40 years ago. There's work by Stan Parker, who's no longer with us, and many others who were writing about leisure and Ken Roberts, who has written books and articles on leisure studies and different aspects of leisure. But the serious leisure framework is still with us, and it's still expanding. It's still very much relevant. It's relevant because it's still being researched. It's still generating that curiosity. And I wonder, Bob, if you could talk to us a little bit about serious leisure, the perspective as a lens for making sense of the work-leisure relationship. Because this is something, what I love about the introduction to the perspective that you've just given is our listeners who listen back from this podcast, you'll hear so much of that in what's been talked about, whether it be agency, taste, play, expression, identity, lifestyle, occupational devotion. We're talking to academics, for crying out loud. There's so much of that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see the perspective helping us negotiate the traditional dichotomy between work and leisure in broader life, the broader lifestyles of people.
I find the perspective really useful for that kind of question. When I wrote the book in 2004 called Between Work and Leisure, the publisher, Irving Lewis Horowitz, said, "Hey, look, there's a lot of work. It's just like the leisure you're talking about." And I had seen this, but already biased by my new fields that were of interest. No, that doesn't work. But Horowitz kept after me. And so in that book, I introduce occupational devotion, or devotee work, and spell it out. And we don't have time in this podcast to get into all of that. And there was that book, and then there's another one coming out, as I mentioned, that links these two and effaces the boundaries between work and leisure. So, and it goes way back to T.H. Marshall, a British sociologist in the 50s, 60s, who observed that there are people, and he was talking about professionals, who work so that they may be, they play at their work, i.e. get paid, so that they may do their work. Most of us work to get paid so we can do something else, like pay the mortgage or whatever. And that's an insightful observation about professional work. And what I've done is expand that, because there's consulting, that's professional, I guess. But there are people that are doing small crafts that are also getting paid so that they may continue to do that. Otherwise, they'd have to work at something else, and then there'd be no time for the craft. And some small businesses are like that. And so that book on occupational devotion explores the full range of kinds of work that are available in our society. Stan didn't see that, Stan Parker. He was busy trying to separate, as were others, work from leisure. And that's not the case. Indeed, there's leisure at work, but that's not related to work. So telling jokes, for example, asking a colleague about how are the kids? They've got COVID. Oh, well, what do you do? And that sort of thing. There's lots of non-work kinds of things happening at work. And then there's things happening when you're supposedly not at work, because the work's so exciting, you bring it home.
Bob, can I ask? I'm interested in this area because looking after a music service, in a way, for me as a musician, and my background is also in using music and the arts to help people with their well-being, kind of different social projects. My background is using music and drama with vulnerable groups of people who might be in prison or in recovery or struggling with homelessness, that kind of thing. That's kind of my roots. And I absolutely love it. And I started as a volunteer in that area of work. And so I'm lucky to have a job that I really love. And also music for me has at different times represented, this kind of serious leisure in a way, I suppose. Spent a lot of time developing my musical skills, and also I do get paid for those as well. But if I'm being honest, at some level, I think depending on what I'm doing, it does depend on how I engage with the activity or how I feel about it. I wondered, when you were exploring that book, did you still find a sort of difference in terms of how people were able to enjoy themselves or relax depending on where they were? I suppose I feel like when I'm doing some of the things that I really love and care about at work, like a music intervention, I get a lot of satisfaction from that. But because I know that I have to do it well because someone's going to be measuring and testing me, it's not quite the same as when I'm, at home knocking around with the real book and just having a bit of a jam and, maybe writing some stuff. I don't know. Could you explain a bit more? Because I just imagine there might be some nuance there, or what did you discover?
Part of the SLP, serious leisure perspective, includes a discussion, especially for the serious part of it, of rewards and costs. And that formula got into the picture very early. In fact, I think in the book on amateurs, published in 1979, there was already a discussion of this kind of stuff. In other words, serious leisure is not an unalloyed joy. There are times, I can't get this part right.
Right.
No, I hate it. No more of Beethoven or whomever. I'm a musician too, so.
Right. Yeah, Chopin, he can do one.
Yeah, exactly. There are frustrations, but there's an overall view that this stuff's a pain in the neck. But in the end, I really love what I'm doing, because if I do manage to get the part right, what a sense of achievement. And then I can play with a group where the part fits, and what a joy that is.
That's interesting. And then I wonder, can I bring you back? You talked about people doing their sort of small crafts and then starting to get paid for that. Mm-hmm. This reminds me of some of my early kind of music gigs, like back when I was in my 20s, and like honestly a sense of disbelief at getting paid to do that. I don't know if it was the same for those people. And then somewhere along the line, the amount of musicking I was then doing was taking up most of my time, which was great. It was good income. But it wasn't a sometimes thing. And if I'm being honest, some of the joy came out of it at that point, and that's that satisfaction of like, wow, I'm getting paid to do this thing that I love, became more like, I'm just really exhausted by doing this all the time. Did you see any patterns like that, or was maybe I'm just weak-minded?
No, you get it in sport particularly, where they have to play football much more than they want to play football, because the owners want to make money, and they don't make money if you don't play. But after 4 or 5 months of this stuff, they'd like a break, the players, not the audience necessarily, the fans in stands. So that's one of those problems. You get an overdose, and the football players, and they don't play nearly as much as the Canadian football players, don't play nearly as much as the major professional leagues, mostly because we got a winter around here, and that soon takes the fun out of anything other than skiing. So the interest goes down. Now, off-season comes, the lads stay in shape, and then they're keen to get back again. So there's this sine wave of, this is great stuff. And then, oh my goodness, the season's wearing on. My bones are old and tired. And so you get that. And some quit for that reason. You know, the bloom is off the rose. I don't want to do this anymore. And at that point, they may be hooked on the money. So they stay because when I do quit, I'll have $1 million or whatever, and that will be great. So that's a problem. And bureaucracies can enter. Physicians, many of them have quit because of the difficulty of all the paperwork that goes with state medicine. And now in America, they got a lot of paperwork, but they get paid well. So, okay, we'll put up with this. But in Canada, they don't get paid so well, but they still got paperwork. And government's intervening and saying what you ought to do and shouldn't do, which may, in a sense, be against medical advice. So in all of these devotee work fields, there are negative things, costs. You know, even in craft, you're selling stuff that you'd rather not have to make because half of your clientele are Philistine. And I'm tired of making this stupid pot, but it sells like hot cake. Better do it so we can pay the damn rent.
I think, I think that is, in a way, though, I think that is an encouraging message for people listening to the podcast, because for people thinking, whoa, my life is such a sellout, my job's nothing close to what I love doing, and I only do my hobby from time to time. Well, I think on the plus side, what we can see there is that actually that keeps a certain sanctity to the leisure space, possibly. I know you've actually talked about some very interesting overlap there between work and leisure, but I think for any of us who may find that we can't put as much time into our leisure as we would wish, that doesn't somehow therefore make that time valueless, or in a way actually protects the novelty of what we're doing and means that we can keep taking benefit over the long term. We don't burn out like those poor footballers who've had enough by the end, Petya, did you want to come in there?
Yes, thanks, Kat. I'm coming in from a different perspective here. So for those of us who've stayed with us from season 1 and our very, very first podcast episodes, you know that I talked about improv theatre and taking improv lessons and being in that beginning of having a kind of casual leisure that gradually became more and more serious. And within that, I've had a few wobbles as I became a little bit more experienced. And then we started having performances. And then you realize actually how inexperienced you are and how difficult it is. And actually committing to having a rehearsal every week, and some weeks you don't feel like it, etc. So it's been a real ups and downs with that. So I was coming to this from not so much the kind of work leisure thing, but actually moving along and becoming more and more serious through that. The one thing that did keep me going was my improv group, and I just love spending time with that group of people, and that's been the kind of constant positivity. But my relationship with how comfortable I feel doing improv, how good I think I am or not, has really wobbled over as I became more serious about it. So, Bob, I was wondering what you can comment on that, please.
Well, it's interesting that you should be doing improv. I ran onto it and studying the stand-up comics. And in Calgary, there was a lively improv group generated by one of the professors of theater in University of Calgary. And a couple of the stand-up comics indeed were improv people themselves. Though usually when they got a job in a comedy club, they did their usual scripted shtick with the audience. But on off days, then they'd be doing improv, and they loved it, of course, and they saw it as developing them as artists, with the word, that you could learn how to be good with language, and you weren't stuck on your script. So they would have an idea when they go on stage in a comedy club, but it wouldn't be like they memorized everything. They know what they would have to do to get a laugh. Or if they didn't get a laugh, then what the cause of that was. But the really good ones, the cause wasn't that they improvised. It was just that the audience was dead that night, or something of that sort. So, or someone would have to go and come to, and be on a booking agent would book them on a series of clubs to go to. Well, it's one thing to go to an urban club. Calgary's 1.5 million people. Then to go out to the sticks, say in Red Deer, Alberta, 100,000 people, but in the midst of a very conservative and rural area. And there's stuff that doesn't work there. And some people, back when I was studying the gang, there was a guy from Britain, Simon Fanshawe. And Simon's gay. He shows up on stage in a pink suit. Goes over very well in Toronto, for example. Comes to Red Deer, he's lucky to be alive. So it's and he had a very good act. It was incredible. I don't think I've laughed at anything as much. Sam?
Yeah, there's so much in this, and I've got about 14 pages of notes, so bear with me 2 seconds. No, what I'm trying to do is trying to knit it together in my head with what we've heard on previous podcasts as well, in terms of, obviously this is the context for the conversation we've been having. But just in what Petty, obviously Petty has shared her story, and Bob, you've brought that kind of comparative piece there as well. But just to draw out for folk, in terms of some of the key features here and what we're seeing and what we're hearing, in all serious leisure, there are those times when we have to persevere. Yes, so Bob's just been given an example of that. Yeah, we have to persevere. It's not all positive, and I think that's part and parcel of this. Particularly if it's a long-term commitment to said core activity, whether it be improvisation or playing a particular sport or playing music or or whatever it might be. There's an element sometimes when we just have to persevere, but also going hand in hand with that is this personal commitment to that task.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we persevere, and the significant effort that entails. And I think we've seen and heard so much of that, the dynamic between those features. And what brings people back is one of the very first things that Bob was talking about. Bob used the word taste, but it's also interest. It's a certain way of looking and wanting to act. So that taste, that interest, that hook, we've talked about the hook before in previous podcasts, is really fundamental to that as well. And so just in the way that you're talking there, Bob, about the dynamic nature of the experience of serious leisure, it's not always wholly positive, is it? There's always, and I think that's sometimes the challenge for folk when we talk about leisure academically.
No.
It's not always a positive experience. What makes this serious is we keep coming back.
That was one of the reasons why I wrote the book Leisure's legacy was to explore common sense and hence casual leisure, and how that influences how we see all leisure, all free time activity. And then we keep, it's free time, so it should be easy. And of course, serious leisure is not. It doesn't just roll over and play dead, as it were, and you master it. And yet, the challenge being there is important too. And so people break legs, and whether in theater or on ski hills, they have their moments when, if they don't persevere, they won't get anywhere. But they do learn that you must keep at it. If you keep at it, you will get it. Now, presumably one reaches a certain plateau, and you simply can't advance because it's beyond your ability. And some people can't accept that. But there was a book came out, I forget the name of the author, but she had interviewed jazz musicians, and many of them were big names. And one of the major themes running through that book was, if only I could play better. Miles Davis saying this, how can you play any better than Miles Davis? But they all felt that there were still hurdles to get over, and they just needed more time to do it. Now, whether that would have happened or not, I don't know, but I suspect that a lot of people in the arts, and scientists too, have to get out of their leisure activity, serious leisure activity, or devotee work activity, because of old age or what have you, never having got to that level of perfection for which they had been striving. So these are aspects, I think, of serious leisure that have not been well examined. And one would need a grant to be able to talk to these people and fly to where they are to discuss the matter, which people would be happy to talk about, Sam.
Yeah, and it's funny you should say that when you say these aspects of the serious leisure perspective have not been examined in real depth, because actually in the stories that we've been hearing through the podcast, they're coming through loud and clear. Mm-hmm. Particularly as mechanisms for negotiating our work-life balance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's how people craft even half an hour for that one activity after they've completed their work obligations. So many of the people we've spoken to have worked or crafted their work around their leisure. And in fact, their work is quite literally getting in the way, but it actually pays the bills. I'm thinking of Sharon Gator and the ultra running and others. And as you've said, in terms of the devotee occupational concept, for a lot of the people we've spoken to, it's just indistinguishable.
Yeah.
For the love of doing it, it's quite literally that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Csikszentmihalyi coined the term autotelicism, wasn't it? So the autotelic means self-goal. So the activity itself, the doing of it, is quite literally all people need. That's what draws them in. And Kat, you've spoken about that, about when you're playing and teaching music. Sorry, Kat, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've been doing some analysis of some interviews that I've been doing with students who come and use Centre for Music. And today, this was the main theme I was looking at, actually, because it was just really interesting that this intrinsic enjoyment of music, in this case, And students, Bob, just to be clear, who come to Centre for Music, they're not studying music for their degrees. That's what makes the project a bit interesting. So, there's architecture students, engineering students, nursing students, and they come to the centre to do whatever they want, and we just help them. But what is so interesting that I was thinking about today was watching these young people try to find the language, to say, well, it's just music, man. I have to do it. Oh, it's just my passion, and I must express it. Or, oh, there's just some kind of voodoo when I'm there and I'm playing with my friend. It's just so interesting seeing people stumbling around trying to lay their hands on something that's really hard to actually describe, isn't it? When you get this sort of special quality in whatever it is, obviously music for these guys and for me too on a good day. But I'm guessing you must encounter this in all kinds of different activities. This sort of like, oh, it's just something about what that is, what that does for me. That's enough. The autotelic experience is what I'm going for.
Well, all of this reverberates around in a social world, so that you feel good about your music, but others feel good about your music too. And so that reverberation of approval, and it may not be that people come right out and say as much, but in jazz circles, somebody's snapping their fingers, this is good stuff. But in the snapping of the fingers and the body gestures are enough to let the performers know that everybody's doing well before an audience of sophisticates in the area. And social world is, I know these people, and I know what they can do, and how critical they can be. So, and of course, this is all taking place in some setting, a jam session or what have you, that had to be arranged. So we don't want to forget that. And I might add at this point, as a sort of commercial, social world is a way of getting larger scale, meso level social structure into the picture. You're overloaded with social psychological concepts. That's good, but it isn't the whole story. So I'm more and more trying to contextualize leisure as micro, meso, and macro. It doesn't fit the usual conception of macro, but it's an important way of showing that leisure is part of larger life, part of the culture, part of the social structure. And we can talk about leisure experience, which, by the way, is the experience of the activity itself. You want to know what leisure is? Ask a downhill skier. He or she will tell you, this is what it is. Man, we go downhill, breakneck speed, and around corners, and if you're lucky, avoid hitting a tree. So that's critical too, those larger level discussions. Anyway, I'll get back to Sam.
Well, thanks, Sam. I was just going to say as well, it's just so interesting, Bob, hearing you emphasise the social elements, because I certainly see that at Centre for Music as well. What's interesting, though, is in my little island, often people doing their leisure with us are not really aware of that dynamic until you get into a conversation. Somehow the conversation reveals the importance of these social structures and dynamics, and that approval you were talking about, somehow often quite unconscious for participants in some way, that part of the community, although the discussion reveals it, like on so many episodes we've had, some of that Sam have talked about, where the process of the conversation, actually then people start to realise that actually there is this whole like community that they're joining. I wonder, I wonder just if you could comment, did you find when you're doing your own research, did participants intentionally go for that social element, or was it more like what I've seen where people are kind of, they experience that and actually becomes a very important agent, but kind of like as a side effect, you know?
The social world is an experience too. Because it's full of gossip, amongst other things. It's full of knowledge in the music world. You know, who's a good repair person? You got to find that out. How do you get hold of music? You got to find that out. That's part of the social world. And the way we've got it broken down is there are special functionaries that actually apply skills for repair, actually apply mediums for getting music. When I was learning in my early days in jazz in Minneapolis, we didn't have all these fancy real books, as they're now called today, which is just a melody line and chord changes. And they've hauled into these books several volumes going back into the 1920s and even earlier. Well, in 1950, 1958, 59, I wanted to have one of these things, but there weren't real books then. They were loose leaf sheets, and they were called, put together, the Black Book. And you got it, and I drove down an alley, met a guy outside his garage, and gave him $20 and walked away with all this paper. So, you know, the issue is copyright. So, but I had to know where to get this stuff. And what was the larger legal and cultural context? Because we didn't hide it. We would put our sheets in a black book and took the black book to a job and played, you know. Then I left jazz and went into classics. And when I came back, the real books were all over. Nobody knew what a black book was. So I grew up in another era. But my point is, this is a social world. But it's also a ranking. There's a stratification in these worlds. Who's good, who's best, who's worst. And of course, there'll be a lot of debate about that. You know the history of jazz, you know, guys like Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane originally started out at the bottom. They were too avant-garde. So, and then they got, you know, dissed by it all by guys like Benny Goodman, and they were just, you know, they were old hat at that point.
This concludes the second episode we recorded with Professor Robert Stebbins. In the final episode with Professor Stebbins, we discuss optimal leisure lifestyles, amongst other things.